I'm Jeff Gemmell with American Purpose. Pleasure to welcome you today. It's 12:01 Eastern. We have a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern, and I have been looking forward to this conversation for some time. This came about 6, maybe 7 weeks ago when Michael Mandelbaum and I were having lunch in Bethesda. And Michael told me he was quite excited about a book he was reading. He thought that it was interesting and relevant in a number of different ways, but including to and for the purposes of American Purpose. I'm going to let Michael speak to that if he wishes, but Michael Mandelbaum will moderate the conversation today. He's a member of our editorial board, book author, distinguished academic. Also read Michael in American Purpose yesterday on sources of Chinese conduct with a good mention and I would say plug for a new book by Hal Branson Bexley. But anyway, that's an aside. The main event here is you, Beverly. Thank you so much for your willingness to do this with us and for us today. Beverly is a historian, academic, Yale University, and the author of an important new book and biography on J. Edgar Hoover. But that's my part. Let me stand back and turn over to you two and to you, Michael, for a proper introduction to Beverly and the conversation today.
Thank you, Jeff. And thanks to Professor Gage for being willing to discuss her new book entitled G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. It is a biography of J. Edgar Hoover. Professor Gage is a professor in the Yale History Department. And my first question is, why J. Edgar Hoover? You say in your introduction that this book took longer than you expected to write. But even if you, and taking longer than expected is, as many of us know, an occupational hazard of writing books. But even if you'd been able to complete it in the time you'd initially budgeted, you would have been committing yourself to spending a fair chunk of your professional life with this individual. You also say in the introduction that you don't count yourself as an admirer of J. Edgar Hoover, although having read the book, I can attest that the treatment that he receives in this book is, to coin a phrase, fair and balanced. But nonetheless, this was a major commitment to a person not universally admired. Why did you decide to make it? What is it about Hoover that made him interesting or important or both enough, sufficiently interesting and or important for you to commit your valuable time to him?
Well, that's a great first question, and one that I often asked myself over the course of the decade plus that I spent writing this book. So it's a real pleasure to now be here and to be able to talk about it and reflect upon it as a finished product. And I think the first part of that answer is what you've already suggested, which is that Hoover as a political figure in certainly popular political discourse, and I think also to some degree within the academy, has a really one-dimensional reputation as a kind of pure villain, one of the worst men of the 20th century, and in particular as a kind of rogue actor, someone who was doing things that had everyone else already known, had they only known, certainly would have disapproved of and put a stop to. And that didn't seem to me to be true to what I saw when I began to really look into Hoover's history. And so I thought there was an opportunity to tell a much more complicated and much more interesting story about this figure who is, I think, still today a household name, and to kind of take him from the margins of our history and put him back where he really was for most of this time, which is in the center of Washington politics, and to tell a sort of different story about Washington, about the growth of the federal government, the security state, and the administrative state in particular. There were two other things that also struck me in thinking about all of this. One is that the last crop of biographies had come out in the late 80s and early 90s, and those are still the main biographies of Hoover. And so even when I started working on this, they were getting a little bit dated, and a whole new swath of records had come out. And so I thought, there have been changes in how we think about our political history, particularly the study of conservatism. There were all these new records out, and Hoover just seemed ripe for reinterpretation.
My next question follows from part of what you said. There is a little watched sequel to the classic 1974 film Chinatown called The Two Jakes. Jack Nicholson's character in both films is J.J. Jake Gittes. And as I was reading your book, it occurred to me that a title or a subtitle of the book could have been, although it wouldn't have been as good as the title you chose, The Two J. Edgars. Because it seems to me that we do get two different political personae in your book. There is the familiar J. Edgar, the man we know and mostly don't love, the imperious bureaucrat, the scourge of domestic communism, the impinger on civil liberties. But there's also another Hoover to be found in your book. And he is, I think, without too much exaggeration, the model civil servant. He is, in a way, a progressive. And although you don't identify him as a progressive, and although he didn't identify as a progressive, he did come to the government first during the Wilson administration. And he was a man who tried, and to rather considerable extent, I take it from what you've written, succeeded in establishing an agency that was non-corrupt, completely honest, nonpartisan, on the one hand, independent, but on the other hand, responsive to the constitutional chain of command, and thoroughly modern and up-to-date, introducing the most up-to-date measures and techniques of law enforcement. So my question is, to what extent is that an accurate characterization of the Hoover you described? And to the extent that it is, how do we account for what seems to be, maybe it isn't, but what seems to be a kind of contradiction at the heart of this man's career?
I think it's a great way of framing it. And to me, there were two kind of big political questions that I wanted to explore in the book. One was simply about Hoover's longevity in office. For those who don't know the lore of J. Edgar Hoover in great detail, he was FBI director from 1924 to 1972. So he was in that job for 48 years under 4 Democratic presidents, 4 Republican presidents. And so the question of how he pulled that off, where his power came from, how he achieved the kind of autonomy that he managed to achieve, that is interesting. And I think related to the second question that you raise, which is how to make sense of the ways that he thought about ideology, his own politics. And to me, it is this puzzle. We have on the one hand, kind of the progressive civil servant. And when Hoover became FBI director in 1924, at least for the first decade, and in many ways longer than that, this was the primary aspect of his reputation. He was nonpartisan. He believed in professionalism. He believed in expertise. His job was to root out corruption in the Bureau. He set up high standards. Right? all of these things that were really essential tools of the progressive state and that he put into effect pretty well. There are lots of moments where he violates them in one way or another. Even as he's doing that, he's choosing men from his own university, from his own fraternity, people who he thinks are going to be personally loyal to him in some way. There are exceptions to all of that, but it's an important part of his identity. It's where a lot of the FBI's reputation comes from. And at the same time, for his whole career, he's a deep ideological conservative. So not only on the question of communism, which is in many ways the cause of his life, anti-communism, but on race, on religion, on law and order questions. And the fascinating thing about Hoover is that he puts these two pieces together. And so in the introduction, I frame him as what I say is a conservative state builder. And that's not a category, but I think has a whole lot of currency in our contemporary politics. And so that's what was interesting to me about him and about mid-century politics and the ways that they were really quite different.
One of the things that I learned from this book that I hadn't known, although it's hardly a secret, is that during World War II, the FBI opened offices abroad, especially in Latin America, where there was a concern about Nazi subversion. And Hoover, after the war, wanted to maintain those overseas bureaus and expand the FBI's overseas operation. He wanted the FBI to become, in effect, the CIA. And when the CIA was proposed as an independent agency, he objected, he resisted, but he was overruled by Harry Truman, the president, who seems to me to have been most robust in standing up to it. But the FBI did retain the counterintelligence and counterespionage duties within the United States. And I think one could say, or at least I would venture, correct me to the extent I'm wrong, that that's what got the FBI into the most trouble, that mission, which is, of course, quite different from the law enforcement mission. His notorious wiretaps on Martin Luther King came about because he was interested in one of King's close associates who had been and perhaps still was a member of the Communist Party. Now, in Great Britain, there is a separate agency for domestic counterintelligence, counterespionage, and now counterterrorism. Great Britain has MI6, which is the equivalent of the CIA, and then it has MI5, which does the things that the FBI has come to do other than law enforcement. So this is a long-winded way of asking you whether you think that the adoption of the counterespionage duties turned out to turn the FBI in an undesirable direction, whether the country would have been better off with a British-style arrangement so that the FBI was Scotland Yard and not MI5, and whether, and this is really a very hypothetical question, it's too late to divide the FBI's functions that way.
Well, you're absolutely right that the FBI is a strange hybrid, right? It is, on the one hand, criminal law enforcement, and on the other hand, domestic intelligence. And those two duties both came out pretty suddenly in the 1930s in the course of just a few years. And so the FBI was created as the Bureau of Investigation, but became the FBI in the mid-30s under Franklin Roosevelt, when very quickly its law enforcement jurisdiction expanded into things like bank robbery and kidnapping, and FBI agents begin to carry guns and go to war with people like John Dillinger, and they get their reputation as G-men, and they become this, New Deal alphabet agency acronym, the FBI. And then very quickly, the Bureau pivots. Some of it starts secretly under Roosevelt and then becomes much more formal during the war itself into all of these domestic intelligence duties. And those are still, as you say, the two things that the FBI primarily does. They kind of go together and they kind of don't go together. And it's clear in the 30s that Hoover was trying to figure out, how to make them both work. And actually the war chapters that you bring up from beginning in 1939 and then up to 1947, when the CIA is created, are some of my favorite chapters, in part because I think that story of the FBI in the war is an underknown part of Hoover's story. But you can see them struggling during those years to figure out how to do espionage and subversion. Hoover had done a little bit of it as a young man in World War I, and then immediately afterwards, mainly surveillance of left-wing radicals and German citizens in the United States. So he had some skill and some experience at it. But it is kind of a fluke of history in that moment. These are both kind of jurisdictions born of crisis. And one of the points of the book is it could have gone a lot of other ways at other moments. So should it have gone other ways? And is it too late for that? Well, I would certainly say that you're right, that the ways that we think about Hoover as a villain and of FBI civil liberties abuses come almost exclusively on the intelligence side rather than the law enforcement side. And one of the struggles that the FBI had then as now was figuring out how are we going to be these incredibly rule-bound, law-bound figures on the one hand, and then do the sorts of things that you need to do in espionage and intelligence investigations, which often are not so rule-bound, and sometimes we're not so law-bound. So all of which is to say, I think you're right. It's the place that Hoover ran into problems, although in some ways he was more restrained than certain figures like Richard Nixon in particular wanted him to be. And as to whether it's a good idea now or too late, I will actually leave that to all of the policymakers here to answer that question. I think it will be pretty hard. The FBI has been this institution, this hybrid institution for quite a long time now, almost a century.
One of the things that struck me in reading the book, and again, you may not fully agree with this characterization, so please say whether and to what extent you do, is that first, and this is not something I think you would disagree with, the FBI was not really a rogue agency. Hoover was a very savvy and ambitious bureaucratic operator, but he never really stepped outside the constitutional lines, which is to say that he always kept the attorney general of the day, who was his immediate superior, in the picture almost always as to what he was doing. And he acted at the behest of presidents. So on the issue of Hoover and presidents, I get the impression that the two presidents at whose direction he engaged in the conduct that, in retrospect, we find most objectionable and disreputable and contrary to the spirit of the Constitution, were Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, precisely the presidents whose domestic accomplishments are most admired by the people who, at the end of his lifetime and subsequently, took greatest objection to J. Edgar Hoover. So my questions are, to what extent is that a fair characterization? And to the extent that it is there a contradiction here, and how are we to account for it?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And I would say two things. So one on Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that was really fascinating to me in doing this research was not only that it was Roosevelt and Johnson who did the most to empower Hoover, and in many ways relied on Hoover to do various intelligence investigations that they wanted done. Roosevelt is really the one, as I just said, who gave Hoover a lot of his power, kind of made the FBI in the 30s and 40s. And then we have Lyndon Johnson to thank for basically giving Hoover a lifetime sinecure. Had things gone otherwise, Hoover would have been forced to retire on January 1st, 1965, when he hit what was then the mandatory federal retirement age of 70. But one of the first things that Lyndon Johnson did when he became president was say, I'm going to keep Hoover on. He exempted him from retirement. And it's one of the reasons that Hoover was able to, last through the 60s into the 70s, and in many ways have his most controversial years. So it was fascinating to me that these two kind of liberal icon presidents were the ones who had done so much to empower J. Edgar Hoover. And then also at many points in Hoover's life that he really was pretty widely supported by liberals and weirdly, in some moments, even by civil libertarians. So I think the peak of this was during McCarthyism, when many liberals and many Democrats, to some degree, including Truman himself, though Truman didn't like Hoover in a lot of ways, got behind Hoover and the FBI as basically the responsible and state-based alternative to Joseph McCarthy, who they described as a demagogue and a liar. And Hoover really gained a lot during those years. He promoted himself that way, and a lot of people supported him. So that was just a fascinating story to me, and one that, because of Hoover's current reputation, I didn't know so much about. As to whether Hoover was a rogue actor, I would say he was a lot less of a rogue actor than his reputation would suggest. There are certain ways in which, of course, he was very, very secretive and didn't give people access to what he was doing. One of those was that he was very, very protective of FBI files. He thought that nothing that the FBI ever did should be made public unless he chose to make it public. And the other is that there were certain techniques that he didn't share. So wiretaps, he usually checked in with the attorney general because he was required to. Bugs, which are microphone plants, right? So wiretaps are telephones and bugs are microphone plants in, say, someone's office or home, or for instance, in Martin Luther King's hotel room. They often didn't ask for permission, in part because those were often breaking and entering operations. And they knew some of it was illegal and they weren't going to get authority. So there are rogue operations. There's secrecy. There's no doubt about that. But I think the big theme is that Hoover had a lot more support, was often acting at the behest of presidents of Congress than his reputation would suggest. And even programs like COINTELPRO, which is probably the most infamous of the FBI's programs, there's lots of evidence in the archives that in off-the-record comments to Congress, in communications with the White House, various administrations, they knew at least the contours of what was going on. He uses words like, we're conducting a disruptive program. And nobody said anything, even if they didn't know every detail.
I have two more questions before we turn the floor over to the other participants in this Zoom session. And I note there are some questions in the chat room already. The first of my final questions is this. The subtitle of this book is J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. It's an echo, I don't know whether it was a conscious one, of Ron Steele's biography of Walter Lippmann, which, in thinking about that, really dates me because that's now 40 years old. But it seems to me that it was only last year that Ron was writing it. In any event, that prompts the following question. It seems that the high point of Hoover's reputation was the 1950s. And I wonder whether you would say that although the 1950s was dominated politically by Dwight Eisenhower, in some ways, Hoover was the representative public figure of the 1950s. He expressed many of the public's central concerns. He was, for many years, among the most respected Americans. He always came near the top of those most respected lists. That in some ways, whether or to what extent he embodies the American century, and I assume that Henry Luce, the coiner of that phrase, was a supporter of his. But in a way, he embodies the 1950s in America. To what extent would you agree with that?
I would agree with that almost totally. I think the 1950s were the high point of his reputation. And I suggested in my comments about McCarthy, even at the height of the Red Scare, right, in 1953, when J. Edgar Hoover is making no secret of his kind of description of the existential struggle against communism, of the fact that the FBI is engaged in very widespread operations against the Communist Party in particular, he was an enormously popular figure. He's getting approval ratings in the 70s, 80s, 90 percentiles. In fact, the first image of the book in the introduction is 1959, when there's this big Hollywood movie, The FBI Story, starring Jimmy Stewart. And it tells the kind of epic tale of the heroic FBI. And I suggest, if Hoover had just retired in that moment, in the late 1950s, we would remember him very differently, because a lot of the divisiveness about his techniques, his operations, the sense that he's out of touch, his really aggressive campaigns against the civil rights movement, et cetera, those all come in the 1960s. They're based in things that are happening earlier. But they come in the 1960s. And so, yeah, I think Hoover really reached his peak of influence during the 50s. And the phrase American century is in part just shorthand for the kind of enormous sweep of his life. And I think that's part of how it's used for the Littman book and many other books as well. Just he was there with his fingers in everything in most of the 20th century. But it also, I think, is my effort to underscore bringing a couple of themes really centrally into that story of the 20th century. One of those being, the administrative state, the security state, not just focusing on kind of elections and political parties and such, but thinking about federal power and what it meant and the complicated nature of its use. And then also trying to put the communist struggle really central in that story. And, that's what Hoover is doing as a very young man. He's the first head of the radical division at the Justice Department at the age of 24. And it's what he's talking about in 1972 at the moment that he dies. And that seems to me to be a really important theme that brings these various moments together.
My final question. The FBI is once again a source of controversy. It's once again under fire. It's once again accused of engaging in activities that are improper for this particular agency. The criticism now comes from the opposite end of the political spectrum, from the source of the criticism of Hoover, which I suppose means that what goes around comes around. But my question is there something inherent in the mission and nature of the agency that leads to all this? And are there any lessons from the Hoover era that would be useful to learn for the present day?
Yeah, I've been fascinated to watch how the FBI's reputation and supporters have changed most dramatically during the Trump years. So from the moment that Hoover died, really up until 2015, 2016, if you had taken public opinion polls, Republicans, self-identified conservatives were much more supportive of the FBI than Democrats and liberals. And now those have almost totally changed. And a lot of that, of course, has to do with Trump's struggles with the FBI, about some of the revelations that have come out as a result of all of that. And so it's fascinating to just watch this history change in such a dramatic way. And of course, we're heading potentially into the first big investigation by Congress of the FBI, really since the Church Committee of the 1970s, which was just in the aftermath of Hoover's death. Now, I think this investigation is going to be a little bit different than the Church Committee and has different aims in mind, but it will be really interesting to watch what's happening there. So I think in many ways, the FBI is still the institution that Hoover created. We said its basic jurisdiction, set of duties looks quite similar. And I would say there's a similar tension between some of its kind of relatively conservative internal culture in certain ways, and then its identity as, and pride in being a professional, nonpartisan branch of the government. I think one point that would really resonate between the past and present is that the FBI is supposed to be and has been set up to be this kind of fact-finding, nonpartisan agency, and yet is constantly being pulled into these highly politicized investigations. Right? And those are particularly problematic when they are within the executive branch. And I think that's part of what we're seeing because the FBI director there are attempts to kind of insulate the FBI director from political pressures, but in the end, is a political appointee, is answerable to the attorney general and the president. So when those are the people that you might be investigating, it gets very complicated very, very quickly. And so I think Hoover dealt with a lot of that in some ways. Hoover's autonomous power, the very thing that we object to about him, gave him a little insulation from political pressure. I mean, what that meant was that he decided to do what he wanted to do, and he kind of didn't do the things that he didn't want to do. And I don't think that that's the model we're going for. So I don't know if there are lessons, except to say that I do think that the structure of the FBI makes it very, very difficult to know exactly what the right course is when you're being pulled into politics and you're supposed to be apolitical, and when so much of the FBI's legitimacy with the public at large and in Washington rests on its kind of nonpartisan apolitical identity.
Thank you. I will now turn the floor over to Jeff for the purpose of turning the floor over to the rest of you.
Michael, thank you very much. Beverly, thank you. The floor is open. I'm going to look for you to press that button for the raised hand function. If that doesn't work properly, wave to the screen. If I miss you, Michelle will be kind enough to say, missed you. So I think Ron Radosh is first and Dan Schro is second.
Well, actually, Eric Alterman's been waiting.
So forgive me, my screen is cut on. Eric, you first. You have the floor. Congratulations on your new book on Israel, by the way, and then Ron and Dan. But Eric, please go ahead.
You're still muted, I think.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. I want to start by congratulating Beverly and mentioning that I wish I love everything about the book except its pub date, which was the same as mine. And what else? I won't say anything else. You can imagine what it's like. So Beverly, my question is this: Jews. We're talking about Hollywood. We're talking about radicals. What did Hoover was Hoover particularly or not particularly anti-Semitic, given his background and the way he ran the FBI? And how did the FBI? What did he think about Jews, and how did they? And what was it like for Jews in the FBI? As I understand that the CIA was actually a wonderful place to be Jewish, relatively speaking, in those days. What was the FBI like?
Well, I would say that the FBI was probably somewhat less wonderful. So I didn't find a lot of evidence of anti-Semitism per se on Hoover's part, right? So you don't get the secret writings like listening to the Nixon tapes or something and finding all of these slurs and comments. So there's not any of that. And in fact, when Hoover was a young man, his first deputy, his number 2 at the Bureau, was a Jewish man named Harold Nathan. and who was older than Hoover was, who Hoover seemed to like quite a lot, and was a pretty high official and important in shaping the Bureau in its early years. But as time went on, two things. One, there's a pretty close identification at the Bureau with Jewish and communist. That's really being sort of proxies for each other. And there's one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, just because it says a lot about the internal culture of the Bureau. It's that in the 30s, there's a brief attempt to organize a union within the FBI. So in its fingerprinting wing, which is not the agents, but people who are kind of in the civil service, and there's a slightly more diverse range of people there, more women in particular, more Jews. They squashed that union organizing attempt, but it's one of the few moments where I see Hoover saying, that's it. We're not going to keep hiring these Jewish agitators. And then the second thing, and I think the really most important, is that Hoover built the agent corps of the FBI in a very particular way. So his fingerprint division and certain divisions of the FBI were under the civil service, but the agent corps was not. And that meant that Hoover could hire the men that he wanted, and he mostly fired men who were a lot like himself. And that meant that he was pretty openly religious. He didn't go to church all that much, but he was a big promoter of Christianity. He had attendance at Sunday school, particularly in the 1950s. This is in politics in a prominent way. And he really built his agent corps around a preference for often Southern, but certainly, white Christian men of a certain conservative bent. And then later on, as the FBI expands, Catholics and Mormons. And so Jews were not one of the chosen categories there for sure. And I think, the culture of the FBI was sort of built around that.
Can I do a quick follow-up here?
Yeah.
By the way, I suppose you said chosen by accident.
No, it was a joke.
So nobody else laughed. My impression is that the Jews who, let's face it, ran Hollywood in the 50s and the 60s were in some way paying for their Jewishness by buying goodwill with the FBI. What did that get for their indulgence? Was there an appreciation of the fact that these were Jews, by and large, who were making these movies that were lionizing Hoover and his agent?
Yeah, it was certainly part of the public conversation. I think to some degree you can see it reflected in Bureau files, right? And it's not just in Hollywood. So you look at the Rosenberg trial, right? The fact that the judge and prosecutors are Jewish is very important, and Hoover's working with them very actively. Figures like Roy Cohn and others going forward. So everybody's very aware of that kind of dynamic, and in the press as well, right? I mean, one of Hoover's great allies is Walter Winchell, and they're, again, collaborating and working very closely together. So I think you can see that a lot of those Jewish figures are, acutely aware of the kind of association with communism and are really courting Hoover to be counted, on the right side of the FBI.
Did the FBI appreciate that fact?
Hoover appreciated his allies. I didn't see a lot of super explicit discussion of that issue in FBI files, but I think it was so much part of the kind of ethos
Thanks
of
very
that
much.
moment. Yeah.
So terrific, Eric. Thank you, Beverly. Thanks. So Ron and then Dan Shro, but Ron, you first, please.
Yeah. Well, let me just. All right. I think I unmuted both video and mute. Can you hear me okay?
Well, we hear you. There's a little bit of feedback, but we hear you.
Oh, well, let's move further away from the computer. Getting back to the last question Michael raised about the old view of the FBI that, as you say in the book towards the end, that the conservative movement essentially was a basis for real support of the FBI. And it is really ironic that what they're saying today on the far right is essentially what the Communist Party, which was on the far left in the 50s, was saying about the FBI. That is, the FBI was fascist. Was the communists said Truman was a fascist too. While people like Arthur Schlesinger, in criticizing some of the HUAC tactics and other infringements of civil liberties, Schlesinger famously said that we have the FBI to do what's right and we can depend on them. And today, that what's his name, Seb Gorka is selling T-shirts that says FBI Fascist Bureau of Information. And it is literally hated. I mean, the call on the far right now is to dissolve the FBI because it's seen as under the control of liberals and so forth. So I find great irony in that. Since you mentioned in passing the Rosenberg case, actually something new just came out that I didn't know until I read the book by Martin Siegel, unpublished yet. It comes out in March, a new biography of Judge Kaufman. And I didn't know that the ex parte communication between the prosecution and the judge took place not just once, but all during the trial. They regularly filled him in behind the scenes on what they knew, including giving all the material they got from Venona, which they didn't want to come out in the court, and Truman wasn't told about.
Right.
I mean, I thought that was an incredible revelation because they wanted Kaufman to have, no doubts about his giving them a stiff sentence. Until I read that, I was running all of that. They actually shared Venona with him, which is quite amazing.
That is amazing. First, thanks for your own work on all of this, which was really informative for me. And the Venona stuff for this book was really fascinating because it gave a lens into at least what Hoover thought he knew at what moment in many of these famous cases, and that was something that the previous generation of biographers kind of hadn't had access to. As far as the conservative movement goes, I think one of the things, particularly in the chapters on the 60s that are in this book, they look at is that on the one hand, Hoover is this great hero of the conservative movement. I mean, the John Birch Society is getting everyone to read Masters of Deceit, right? It's doing all of this. But there was always a pretty deep tension there. Even as conservatives are embracing Hoover, right? They're denouncing the federal bureaucracy, they're denouncing federal power. And Hoover was always kind of the one exception. But in some ways, it's not so surprising to see this turn come around eventually. That a right that's increasingly kind of anti-statist, that at least certain parts of which have lost respect for and come to challenge, the whole ethos of the nonpartisan administrative state, in addition to being upset about the investigations of Trump. I think you can see that some of those tensions were there, even in the 60s, even when Hoover is being very widely hailed by the right.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So thank you, Ron. Thanks, Beverly. Now, Dan, you have the floor.
Okay. Yeah. This is hardly my area of expertise, and I haven't read your book. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned, which I'm curious about, that you must have come across, was the obsession with homosexuality. Now, that was pretty general in the 50s, and somehow, just as you said, there was sometimes this association Jew equals communist. There was this association homosexual equals communist, which never made much sense to me. I mean, I understand the fear of blackmail, but somehow being homosexual is communist. And in a way, that's come back now. The right, one of the planks of the right is to attack against that. So was Hoover just like everyone else, or was he particularly obsessed by it? Was it, it's displayed fairly prominently. And of course, I mean, everyone knows there were sort of hints that he was covering himself up. I mean, what did you find about that? No one's asked that question yet. And maybe if I'd read your book, I would know but I haven't read your book. So that's my question.
Right. Well, I do write a lot about this in the book, and from, I guess, two different perspectives. So one is the question about Hoover himself, and particularly his relationship with Clyde Tolson, who was the number two in the Bureau. And it's a fascinating story because they have a real social partnership that is widely known, widely respected. They had all their meals together. They traveled together. I mean, they just spent every moment together. And they were really treated like a social couple. So if you were having a dinner party in Washington and you were going to invite Edgar, you were also going to invite Clyde. They're sending Christmas cards, referring to each other, et cetera. So they basically are a couple, in addition to being the number one and number two men at the FBI. Neither one of them ever seriously date women. Neither one of them marries. And so at the moment that Hoover dies, and the honor guard folds the flag on his casket, they turn and they hand it to Clyde Tolson, basically as his spouse and partner. So that's the most important relationship of Hoover's life. It's clear that he never dated women. Were they having sex with each other? Well, we just don't know, because we don't know that about most people. But there is this private story about Hoover, and also about his awareness of the rumors and the suggestions that were there, even at the time, that he himself was gay, that he was in this relationship with Tolson. And he used the FBI to actively police those rumors. So if you said in an errant moment to someone at a dinner dance, in one case, that you had heard these rumors about the director, you might get an FBI agent knocking on your door saying, these are scurrilous rumors. You should never say such things. So a lot of the book deals with that piece. And then that has to be in conversation with the big story that you're talking about, which is the Lavender Scare of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and what became federal policy, which was that you could not be homosexual and be employed by the federal government. Now, of course, there were a lot of gay people who were still employed by the federal government, but the loyalty investigations of the 1950s were very pronounced, and drove many, many people out of their jobs. And the FBI was charged with conducting many of those investigations. So Hoover conducted those investigations. He conducted them aggressively. He didn't create the policy, right? That was federal policy much more broadly than the FBI. And interestingly, he didn't talk about it publicly very much. So if you look at what he's saying in the 1950s, he's giving endless speeches, got this huge FBI public relations apparatus devoted to his views on religion and on law and order and on communism especially. And there are very, very few public mentions of homosexuality, I think, in part because he felt vulnerable on that question. So it's a complicated story, but certainly the FBI is deep in these in the workings of the Lavender Scare. One of my another kind of favorite incident is when the first gay rights organization starts to form in Washington, the Washington chapter of the Mattachine Society in the early 1960s. Pushing back against these federal anti-gay policies. They put Hoover on their mailing lists and start inviting him to lectures and meetings. And the FBI is conducting surveillance of them at the time. And there's just Hoover gets very mad that he's on these mailing lists. And then that ends up in a kind of funny exchange where the heads of the Mattachine Society are brought into the FBI, and they basically say, we'll take the director off of our mailing lists if he'll take us off of his lists. And it's a kind of funny moment. I think
You're muted.
Jess.
Thank you very much. I thanked you, Dan, for the question, and I said we have fewer than 10 minutes left. I have a question, but I'm going to hold it with the hope that someone else would like to go ahead, someone who's not yet spoken or posed a question. Anybody I'm not seeing? Michelle, any hands up that I'm neglecting? So hold that thought. My question to you, Beverly, is as follows. The book has been widely reviewed and extremely well reviewed, but one of the reviewers may have been in the New York Times, described this as a humanizing but not sympathetic portrait, and spoke to your ability to bring out the complexity in this otherwise great American villain. In that journey of yours, with all the meticulousness and fair-mindedness and objectivity, I assume, one brings to such a work assumptions. And my question to you is, were there particular pieces of the research that just flat out surprised you? This way or that, you said, wow, that I didn't expect.
I loved that phrase, humanizing but not sympathetic, because that really is what I was going for with the book, was to make him not just, this one-dimensional villain, to make him a human being, to make history move across time, to see that who he was as a young man has certain consistencies with who he is as an older man. But of course, there's lots of change over the course of the process as well. So I would say that the pieces that surprised me the most were the pieces that didn't fit with that image of him as, a kind of great villain, certainly from the perspective of the left or of liberals. But I, came of age with that reputation of Hoover's. And so the moments that were surprising to me tended to be moments when, for instance, I saw him at the very moment that he is conducting totally outrageous counterintelligence and disruptive efforts against Martin Luther King, he's doing the same thing to the Ku Klux Klan, right? People tend to know about the King stuff for good reason. A lot of people don't know about these campaigns against the Klan, against white supremacist movements. Another moment that surprised me was his opposition to mass Japanese internment in 1942. The FBI had its own very particular internment program that they already had underway that was not just aimed at Japanese citizens, but was aimed at Germans and Italians and the citizens of other belligerent countries that the United States had decided, the FBI had decided were dangerous in some way. But Hoover thought mass Japanese internment was a terrible idea, thought it was politically bad. He thought it was unconstitutional to intern American citizens. He thought it wasn't necessary from a security perspective. He thought it impugned the FBI. And so, but that's another interesting moment. So those are a couple of the redemptive moments. I would say the thing that I found most surprising that fit a little more with what I already thought about Hoover was what I discovered about his college fraternity, which was a group called Kappa Alpha. And it turned out that they were a quite explicitly Southern fraternity. They had a lot of very prominent segregationists, Southern Democrats in the chapter as alums when Hoover was there around Washington. And so, to the degree that his racism and his ideas about the racial order shape a lot of what comes next, I could see some of that information in a way that seemed really important there. And I've known about that.
So Jeff, I have a couple of final questions.
Then it's your time, Michael. Over to you,
okay,
please.
Thank you. First, I should note that in his question, Ron Radosh, of course, is the co-author of the definitive book on the Rosenberg case, as well as many other important books, accidentally referred to the judge in the Rosenberg case as George Kaufman rather than Irving Kaufman. George Kaufman is, of course, the most popular American playwright of the first half of the 20th century. And I believe the central difference between the two was that George Kaufman was funnier. Two final questions for you, Beverly. First, the people with whom he had to deal who seemed to dislike Hoover most were the Kennedy brothers. And there are two pictures in your book which show Hoover together with them. And the Kennedys look extremely uncomfortable, as if they would rather be not just somewhere else, but anywhere else. So the question is, we will never know, but do you think that had they still been in office, they would have tried to retire him? And second, Hoover becomes a national figure in the early 30s because of the gangsters, because of Dillinger. That's when the term G-men comes into vogue. And it was really the making of him, although, as you say, he wasn't all that eager to get involved in the way that he did. There's a kind of second coming of that episode toward the end of his career with organized crime. Could you say something about his approach to organized crime?
Yeah, and those questions, I think, of the Kennedys and of organized crime are quite intimately related. It's absolutely true. I mean, I chose those pictures for a reason because they made me laugh and because they all look so miserable together. And I think it was representative of Hoover's relationship with the Kennedys, particularly Robert Kennedy. Who came, it's worth remembering. I ended up having a little sympathy for Hoover, surprisingly, in those relationships, because here he's been in office all this time. This 35-year-old brother of the president is brought in as the attorney general and as his boss and starts kind of ordering him around. And Hoover's in his 60s at that point. So you can see where some of the tension and resentment came from. So there were a lot of conflicts there. The Kennedys talked, it seems, about getting rid of Hoover, how they didn't like him for sure. It doesn't seem like they were making any moves to do anything about it. And maybe they would have tried to just let that retirement moment come. That seems entirely plausible. And tried to get Hoover out. But I think it would have been politically difficult, in part because they were so vulnerable to the conservative wing of the Democratic Party at that point, the conservative Southern wing, most of whom really liked Hoover, and I think would have resisted his ouster. And ultimately, John Kennedy says this is a political question. On organized crime, that's one of the places that they get into conflict. And I think the Kennedy story, the story that someone like Arthur Schlesinger tells, is the FBI hadn't been doing anything. Crusading young attorney general comes in, really whips the FBI into shape. They go after organized crime. They get Jimmy Hoffa, et cetera, et cetera. And there's some truth to that, but it's also clear that certainly by 1957, 58, the FBI is engaged in its own organized crime efforts. A lot of them are secret. They involve bugs and other things that they don't want to make public. So it's not very widely known, but they were doing some of it even before Robert Kennedy came along. And it's one of the reasons Hoover got so mad, is that that wasn't being recognized.
Well, then, Michael, thank you for doing such a beautiful job in managing this conversation. Thank you all for participating. Beverly, congratulations. I'm sorry I cannot hold the book up. It's on my iPad, but Michael has a physical copy.
It's also very heavy.
That's wonderful, Michael. Thank you. It's called G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and Making the American Century by Beverly Gage. Michael, what a wonderful conversation you ran for us today. Beverly, what a splendid conversation partner. For those of you who are inclined to do so, turn, if you're able to, your camera on just to say hi and bye. And I'm wishing everybody good afternoon or good evening if you're joining us in Europe. Thanks very much. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Michael.